A major rethink of the Irish education system, which is on the table, from shorter school days to a reduced curriculum and more mental health supports in schools. A new report from the Oireachtas Education Committee, inspired by the Finnish model, argues students here are under too much pressure and need more time to recharge and learn holistically. Would love to get your thoughts on this as a parent or maybe somebody working in the education sector. 086 1800 964 or 0818 400 964. But joining me now to discuss the report and the recommendations is the Fianna Fáil TD and the Chair of the Oireachtas Education Committee, Cathal Crowe. Cathal, good morning.
Good morning, Alan.
Thanks very much for being with us. So you and your colleagues were looking closely at the Finnish education model. I suppose there's so many different aspects of Scandinavian and particularly Finnish life that we look to with envy, and this appears to be another one. What stood out to you most from that particular visit?
So our committee visited Finland in January. It was a cross-party delegation. I led as chairman. And I suppose we've long heard in the Irish education system that the best example, best in inverted commas, you have to go and see for yourself kind of thing, but the best example of an education system in Europe, people say, is the Finnish one. So we went off to see how they manage special education, literacy, numeracy, even school meals, school transport. We went to see how all of their models work, and we came back with some ideas, and there are other things I think would be totally unworkable or unrealistic in the Irish context. But I suppose just to give you some flavours of what we saw, first of all, their school meals have been up and running since 1946, so it's a very refined system. Instead of 14 options on the menu, which would be typical in an Irish context, they just have 2 options in the whole country. The day we were there was 2 options on the menu. The food was served on plates with knives and forks, not tubs. In terms of the curriculum, they have a more condensed curriculum, less subjects. They have less contact hours in the classroom. Sometimes there may only be 3 hours of teaching in a day, and the children get way more breaks. Now, I was a teacher before going to the Dáil in 2020. I'm not suggesting we reduce the school day, but I think the idea of more school breaks during the day is certainly worthwhile. Any adult or teenager or child trying to learn content, after a while your brain gets fried, you zone out, you don't listen as much as you should be listening, and there's a lot to be said for just going out to the yard, having an additional break in the day and recharging yourself and going back into the learning context.
Okay, I mean, I'm sure all of us have been through the school system, and when you look at the number of subjects you have to study for exams and so on, we'll feel that the curriculum is overloaded. And would reducing the number of subjects or changing the point system make a real difference, do you think?
So there are changes on the way in the Irish context, and around 3 weeks ago I took a day out from the political work and I returned to my old school in Partine. I joined the teachers there where they were having a curriculum training day. So it's good to see there's a new subject coming in called well-being, and it is what it says it is. It's all geared around mental health and promoting confidence and resilience in young people, and making them feel a bit better about who they are and the world around them. I would make the point, and that's a really good subject, and I don't want to take from it, and I can't wait for it to be rolled out, but I would make the point that for many young people, I'm talking about children now more than adolescents and teenagers, sometimes a good run around in the yard, some fresh air, is just what you need in a day. It could be just to clear the head, to feel re-energised, to go back in. They do that in Finland, even on the coldest days. In Ireland, we're known, some other countries smile at the fact that when it gets cold here, the weather gets inclement, that public transport shuts down, schools have to close, but they just go at it every day of the year. They're out there, they get those additional breaks, and I think overall it's a good thing. I think when it comes to well-being and how well our children are feeling, sometimes you can overthink things. Certainly there's a place for counselling, in-school therapeutic supports. I'd be a very big advocate for. But sometimes children just need to be children. We as adults don't always need to overthink things. And I think sometimes playtime, allowing them to express themselves in the yard, run around, even if there's a gale blowing up and down the yard, that energy of the wind can sometimes re-energise them. Back in, you learn better. And I went back last year to do a short course myself, and I found myself, even as an adult who spent a long time at the back of the class and more years at the front of the class teaching, you zone out after a while. You just don't learn. And in the Irish primary school context, we're trying to jam in at the moment 13 subjects a week. And it's literally, close your maths book, take out your Irish book. I know teachers are encouraged, and we learned this in Mary I when I was training up, to give brain breaks and movement breaks in between. But still, it's an overload for teachers. It's overload for pupils. And the Finns aren't that keen on homework either. A little bit is required, but do you really need to do this full repetition for an hour when you go home after school as well? I don't know.
Yeah, and that word you mentioned, Cathal, repetition is key, because the number of subjects you mentioned there, one description of our system that a lot of people touch on, our education system, is the rote learning. And maybe that's necessary, because if you're doing 13 subjects, it's hard to do anything other than try and soak up the essential information on one and move and try and retain as much of it as possible and move on to the next one. But really, does that stand to you post your educational phase of your life? Once you get on to third level and beyond that, I hear it quite often, people say they've forgotten quite a lot of what they learned in primary and second level.
Yeah, I mean, I was born in 1982, and I had my best years in school, and I think a lot of people, some people have had positive and negative experiences, but the whole idea of rote learning was, it was a 19th century kind of model of education, a Victorian model of education. It served our country well to a point. It left a lot of people behind, and I think education has to become far more inclusive. Do we really need to know every river and lake in the country? I don't know. The one subject I'm seeing being introduced, and I was in Parateen, we were part of a pilot of cluster schools along with Cratloe, Killaloe and Ennis National School. This was a few years back, to bring in STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. So maths shouldn't be an abstract subject with numbers on a page, solve the riddle and move on. It should relate to something real life, whether it's something mechanical or trying to program a computer or trying to work out a shopping list, or even, trying to book a holiday, getting the configurations of passengers and times and digital clocks. That's kind of real life stuff that people do, and I think that's where maths is heading. That's a good thing. The other thing we saw, Alan, was that in Finland, this was I think a game changer. They have all of their therapeutic supports in the school, or if it's a small school, they cluster with other schools. So instead of a child with additional needs being referred onto this long waiting list that they may not be seen for a long time, there's someone down the corridor who gets to see that child throughout the day in the play environment with their friends, coming in and out of the school door. That's the person who usually gets to see the child and therapeutically support them. And we are trialling that in 5 counties in Ireland, but I can't wait for that to come to Clare, because that is the game changer, if you ask me. We can meet children's needs far better in the school context, rather than putting them on these abstract waiting lists, as I said, that take far too long to clear.
Can I ask you about these school meals? The report touches on that, and you've highlighted challenges in rural Clare. Can you just talk a bit more about, you mentioned earlier on that instead of 14 options, they have just 2, and when people hear that without any further information, they might think, well, that seems like a very, given the number of children that would be served and the differing needs, requirements, that 2 options doesn't seem like much, but clearly there's something in it. So can you just tell us a bit more about that and how it would be beneficial if the system were replicated here?
Yeah, so I've had school meals. I think you can only really give an opinion when you've had a bit of lived experience. So we had school meals in Finland, and I've had some here in Ireland. I think the quality of food we're serving in Ireland is quite good. It's not like there's no perfect standard across the board, but I've seen really high quality meals. Some of them produced in Clare, some in neighbouring Tipperary. Good food. In Finland, also good food, but they have a much narrower option. So the government decided after decades of running the scheme that some options work and some don't. And the day we were there, we had it was kind of a lentil and chicken curry. It was very nice. There was salad. But the big thing they had was that instead of, they have a really positive food culture. So in Ireland, the school lunches are typically served from tubs with disposable cutlery. You push aside your books, your copybooks on the desk, and out comes a tub. You eat your lunch, and then it has to be brought home and, thrown in your bin ultimately. In Finland, no such tubs. It's served on a plate with a knife and fork. Also, the child decides their own portion. So they collect the food from a bamboree, like you or I would do if you're at a buffet. You decide what your portion size will be. So the child in junior infants obviously won't need a huge lunch, but the child in 6th class, or their equivalent of 6th class, who's playing sport or doing Irish dancing, they're burning twice the energy. They need a larger lunch. So look, sometimes simplicity is the way to go. The other thing that might be of interest to people in Clare this morning is we have a huge problem in our county, a rural county, where it's very lucrative for a lunch contractor to provide into Ennis or Shannon or East Clare, where there's many schools in a geographical area. But we're finding it increasingly difficult to get contractors to go out to the extremities of West Clare, Carrigaholt National School being one of them. So as chairman of the committee on education youth, I've recommended that we now start bundling contracts. If a contractor is going into Ennis and getting 3 or 4 of the larger schools, they must also take on contracts now in West Clare. I'm also suggesting that we strike out water charges for schools. It makes no sense that the lunch on the table is free, taxpayer funded, but the water in the tap that the children fill their bottles with and drink is charged to schools. So hopefully things like this will come about. We've seen how it works well in Finland. I'm not saying the grass is always green on the other side. They do have issues as well. I wouldn't be for replicating the length of their school day. It's too short in my opinion. But we have seen good ideas and we're trying to bring those home.
The mentioning of counselling supports is described as a game changer, and I guess maybe we're becoming more aware of that since the experience children had with school during COVID. But at the moment, some children are waiting months or even years for support. So how would the proposals address that particular issue?
So I think it wasn't until COVID, as a society, we started to talk about, maybe children have mental health problems. Depression, anxiety, all of that very much came into discourse after COVID. So in Ireland, every child who has, those additional needs, be they emotional or be they cognitive or learning, they get funneled through the one channel. It's mainly to CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. I think no one case fits all, but I think if it's emotional, behavioural, anxiety kind of stuff, I think that should be dealt with in school, vis-a-vis in-school therapeutic supports. The likes of CAMS, I think, should be really there to support people, with cognitive impairments, children who are finding learning difficult and will always need to have supports to get through the schooling system. So they have that in Finland. We are trialling it in 5 counties, as I said, in Ireland, where it has been opened up. It's a success. There are schools like Gaelscoil, Vigil, Keysog and Ennis who are paying out of their own coffers for play therapists to come in. That has been transformational. So the sooner this gets mainstreamed, fully funded on a county-wide basis, I think it'll make a massive improvement. It will also clear up these backlogs we're seeing on waiting lists, because now you're kind of triaging, I guess is the word, children who have emotional, behavioural, anxiety issues that can be dealt with at a lower level of intervention versus those who have these cognitive impairments that will be with them lifelong.
I'm sure many parents listening this morning, Cathal, will say, a lot of this sounds great in theory, but in practice, the reality of it would create major headaches, particularly shorter school days. I know I'm, as a parent, and thinking, well, it's already difficult enough post-school, to ensure that your children are either collected by somebody who's has a situation where they're able to collect them when you're still in work or after school or whatever it might be. And, there'll be parents who maybe are having to work late as well because, they're the working poor and they need to try and make ends meet, and will think, God, well, this is going to create either additional costs in terms of finding someone to look after my children or additional logistical headaches. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so look, at the first instance, I would say school isn't a child-binding facility, but I do get, as a parent as well, we all gear our family life around the school calendar, the school pickups. It's how families timetable their lives. So we saw in Finland, this is the bit I think will be utterly unworkable in Ireland. Their school day for some classes can only be 3 hours long. So they're coming home quite early. I think it's excessively condensed sometimes in Finland. So I don't think that would work so well. I think the idea of 9 till 3 o'clock or 9:20 to 3 o'clock kind of context in Ireland works quite well, and it's a little bit longer in the second level. The one thing we saw, though, was it's interesting to see some of the societal differences in how parenting and supporting children works. When we were in a school, they were finishing up at like 1 o'clock, and at this time now we'd been sitting down having lunch with children there. There were 9-year-olds heading off from city schools in Helsinki on public transport all by themselves to the local community swimming pool. And we were kind of shocked by this because I have a 9-year-old son. There's no way in hell I'd let him off on the bus to go to the pool in Shannon by himself and come back home again. Which
a lot of parents would agree with, and never mind the fact that public transport mightn't be an option, depending on what parts of the country you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't even know would a 9-year-old be admitted on a bus by themselves here on a public bus as opposed to a school bus. But the whole Finnish thing, and it's a cultural thing they're quite proud of, is that from an early age they try to instill independence in their children. They support them both in school and outside of school, and they also said it's quite a safe place to live. So I suppose hats off to them. It wouldn't be a system I would see being replicated here in Ireland too soon. Look, we got good ideas there, Alan. We're not saying everything there is perfect, and I think there are ideas from Ireland that they would like to replicate. Any teachers listening in would probably be quite defensive, as I would be, of the Irish system. It is a good system. It's tried and tested, but I think there's little elements now we could tweak. And personally, the one I brought home myself was, I think, this idea of maybe an extra little break in the day, doesn't do anyone any harm, and I think everyone comes in a little bit better energised from it.
They're certainly ambitious proposals, but what's the next step now, Cathal? I mean, what are the biggest obstacles to actually implementing them? I mean, would you anticipate resistance from within the education system?
Yeah, so the report has gone to the minister, and over the years, people have said, what is the value of these reports? Well, the therapeutic supports I referred to a few moments ago with you, that was a report from our committee a few years ago. That was taken on nearly, word for word, and it's been implemented. So some of these reports don't see the light of day. This one has been published. It's a good report. We don't think everything will be incorporated into government policy, but some should. I mean, the idea of that additional lunch break, that does not cost the taxpayer an additional euro. There's nothing in it. Some of the school meal reforms we're thinking and suggesting about, they're not very expensive. The idea of bundling contracts costs nothing, but it would ensure that kids in West Clare would have a lunch every day. So there's some common sense things here. One of the proposals that would be costly is we're suggesting school meals should roll out to all secondary schools. That isn't a programme for government. It will happen at some point, but we're suggesting, let's get on with it, let's get it done. So there are, some things will have a cost, but I think if there's elements there, without costings or without a charge on the taxpayer, let's go with them if they make sense. But we'll see in the coming weeks what happens with that.
Okay, just before I let you go, you were, of course, on with us last week with Donna McGilligan talking about the government's measures that they announced to address rising fuel costs and fuel prices. And one of the, I suppose, aspects of that we spoke about was the reaction from the agriculture sector. Needless to say, they weren't happy with it. The reduction in green diesel didn't match the increase of 50 cent in green diesel over the past number of weeks. Something you said during the conversation, though, you've had time pause to reflect on that and maybe feeling a bit of a mea culpa coming on. This was in relation to farmers in the county who mightn't be as badly impacted in terms of the effect of the prices of fuel because the way they use vehicles are different. Can you just flesh that out and why it is that maybe you want to kind of address that particular point?
Yeah, so before coming on air, I was speaking with your researcher, Evelina. I think it's important I maybe clear up a position I made on radio last week. So I farm myself down home with my father, and a lot of farmers in Clare would have a tank of diesel in the yard where they would go around when the tractor's running low, you fill it up and you continue with your work. That'd be quite typical. So when you asked me, would farmers feel the pinch of these fuel hikes, I said for many farmers, it may be, the summer period before they would feel that. And that is the case for many. However, it doesn't reflect where contracting is at. And we're now into contracting season where slurry's been put out, and very shortly, if the weather, improves a bit, we'll be into a silage season. Contractors have no such luxury. They're paying the price at the fuel pumps at any time. That has to be passed on to farmers as well. So I think my answer didn't fully reflect that this is a sector no different to haulage and no different to the families putting the car on the road each morning to go to school and work. Farmers are hugely feeling this. I spoke with many contractors in the last week, and I spoke with Minister Darragh O'Brien's team, and a letter has gone into the Minister for Finance, which I support, asking that farming, along with some other sectors, and that's a whole different debate, but I think an intervention is needed here. And I did say when I was on air with Donna last week, the war situation is fluid, so has our responses to be fluid. The war seems to be deepening, and I think we're going to need an intervention here for farmers and other sectors, Alan, and I've been making that case on behalf of them. So I wanted to clear that up, because sometimes in the course of an interview you can say something which sounds like, God, your man he's tone deaf to the needs of our community. I'm not. I farm, but I accept that contracting has become excessively expensive, and we can't just allow that to continue as it is.
Did you receive a bit of blowback pretty soon after the interview, Cathal?
Oh yeah, I did, but that would be typical. And I guarantee you, people do listen to Clare FM. I guarantee you, when I
hope so.
My laptop in a few minutes, there'll be feedback on today's interview as well. So look, you run a good show, and I think you can't beat as a constituency TD, whether it's doing clinics or being on air or floating around the county. You get a real temperature gauge of what people are feeling, and you know what? Across the board, people are dreading the next heating bills. They're dreading going to the fuel pumps, and I think at times like this, government need to use the huge tax take we're taking to make life a little bit easier for people. Hopefully this war will end soon enough, but by God, it's doing plenty of damage, even though we're thousands of miles away from Iran, but it's doing plenty of damage. And
that is for sure.
Hormuz is now being spoken about all across the county, a geographical location none of us knew of.
We know it better than some of the rivers and lakes that you said we probably shouldn't need to know.
Unfortunately.
All right, Cathal, thank you very much. That's the Fianna Fáil TD, Cathal Crowe, Chair of the Oireachtas Education Committee, with us on Morning Focus.